At 3, James started pretending to be a pilot with an attention to detail that astonished his father.
One day he dragged a car seat into the closet in my office, and he set up a little cockpit in there. He had a little play school console, and like it was going to be a cockpit, you know, and he's going back and forth. All of a sudden, the door comes flying open, and he comes rolling out of it. I said, James, what happened to you? He says, I said, did you fall? He says, no. He says, my plane got shot, and I bailed out.
The next breakthrough came when Bruce was invited to the Natoma Bay Veterans Reunion. He asked about the names of men killed in battle, and this led him to finally solving the mystery of James 3.
He called me on the phone and he said, you won't believe this, there's only one guy from Natoma Bay who was killed during the battle for Iwo Jima, and his name was, it was James M. Houston Jr. And I said, wait, that would make our James 3. I was so excited. I'm like, that's him. It's James M. Houston. His name is James, it's the James 3.
James Houston Jr., World War II Navy pilot. At age 21, on March 3, 1945, his plane was shot down over Chichijima. Now, the skeptical parents were sitting on compelling proof that their little boy really was reincarnated.
James M. Houston.
The incredible possibility that he was James Houston, reincarnated.
This plane, the Wildcat, is the plane that James M. Houston crashed in. And he was a test pilot for the Corsair, and he would test fly those off of carriers. The F-18 is the plane I want to fly when I grow up.
Since he was 2, James showed an unusual fascination for military air shows and an uncanny familiarity with vintage aircraft. His parents cautiously made contact with James Houston's only surviving relative, his sister, Anne. At first, she didn't know what to think about the little boy who claimed to be her brother, reincarnated. But then, James asked her for a painting that only one person other than her knew existed.
She sent this January 16th, 2006. It says, Dear James, I do hope that this is the picture you asked for. It is the only one of me done by my mother. I am sorry to be so long sending it to you. These past few weeks have been very busy and hectic. I hope you like it. With my love, Annie.
James believed then, as he does now, that it was the dead pilot's soul asking for that picture.
I had asked her for a painting that my past mother had done for her and me. This was in her attic for 50 or so years. My parents and she thought it was crazy that I would know about something like this.
Anne, too, became a believer. And there were other, more chilling connections. James had 3 G.I. Joes he named Billy, Walter, and Leon, names his parents thought were strange for a boy to choose.
Bruce is like, hey, James, what are you going to name your G.I. Joe? And he's just playing, he goes, Walter. And so we were like, Walter? And Bruce goes, how come you named your G.I. Joes Billy, Walter, and Leon? And he goes, because that's who met me when I got to heaven. And it was one of those moments where, like, the blood drained out of our face, and we just kind of walked backwards. Bruce went in the office, I went in the office, we closed the door. He's in there going through papers like this. I'm like, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? He finds this piece of paper, and he's like, and he says, Billy Peeler, Walter Devlin, and Leon Connor were all in the same squadron as James Houston. I was like, when did they die? Did they die before? He's throwing papers around, pulls out another sheet, and he looked at the dates of death, and they all died before James Houston died.
They all flew with him.
Although James's dad remained skeptical that reincarnation might really be possible, what happened next was uncanny.
So we're cleaning up the yard. He's playing in the leaves. I said, I just love you to bits. And he goes, well, he said, I knew you'd be a good daddy when I picked you. And I said, what? And he said, well, when I found you and Mommy, I knew you would be good parents. My head was shrinking to the size of a raisin, you know, my brain. I said, what do you mean when you found us? He said, well, I found you and Mommy in Hawaii.
James told his father that he saw them in a pink hotel, which is where the Leiningers were staying when they decided to have James. Bruce and Andrea were cautious about asking doctors and psychiatrists for help. They decided to find their own solution to James's ordeal. And their solution was to go to Japan, to the very expansive ocean where the pilot, James Houston Jr., died.
Thou who art the pilot of the souls of men.
The boat was right above where the wreckage of the plane was. And Bruce did this beautiful memorial service, and so I thought that was a perfect moment for me to just say, I sat down with him and I said, Jim Houston's been a part of your life for as long as we can remember, and he's always going to be an important part of who you are, but you have a life to live as James Leininger, and it's time for you to say goodbye and to Jim Houston. And he just started bawling. And he cried for about 20 minutes.
Yeah, he had everyone on the boat.
It was the saddest thing I ever seen.
He had everyone on the boat.
Crying. It's time for us to say goodbye.
James Houston. Goodbye, James and Houston.
Good job.
I salute you.
Good boy. You're so brave. You're such a brave soul. Such a brave soul and spirit.
It was weird when we got back to shore. It was something had changed.
He left something there.
He really did. It was palpable. You could see that he'd mourned that and everything that had happened and was ready to move on. And he really did at that point. That's kind of when everything really changed.
I'm going to be the same thing that James M. Houston was, a pilot.
The next picture that James Leininger drew was one of peace. The nightmares stopped. The memories started to fade.
I don't want him to remember anything about his past life. He has a life, and I don't want him to be bogged down or confused or...
Well, he's our son, he's not Jim Houston.
Got a life to live.
Today, James Leininger can remember nothing specific about the soul that used to torment him. At 12, he is an ordinary boy.
I believe that the spirit that I used to have when I was 4, 5, 6 has gone away. I'm just James now. It's not... I still have James Houston in me, I think, but it's not so much the bad history. It's more of the peaceful history.